The elves gazed toward the distant horizon. Dawn was fast approaching. Like the moment of a mortal's birth, few remember the dawn. Most are asleep, wrapped in the oblivion of their unconscious minds. It is a fleeting moment, an arcane interstice between total darkness and all the wonders that burgeon under the divine light of Magnus. Standing before the gathered masses were two figures, resplendent in their aureate armour, that took the crepuscular rays of morning and diffused them into a million beatific beams which bathed the elves. How could they ever be bested when Auriel, grandson of Anu the Ineffable, and Trinimac the Golden Champion led them into battle? It was in this transient moment that every last elf learned why the land they defended was called Dawn's Beauty. Never, so long as Merkind lived, would they surrender this land to Lorkhan the Trickster and his horde of weakened souls called men. For the men brought Sithis into every corner. They brought darkness, and soon, when the sun had fully crested the eastern horizon, the wandering Elnathay, led by the Deceiver, would descend from northern Altmora, and they would be crushed. A solemn silence fell over the old Elnathay as they awaited the invaders. Of course they were late. The men would be lethargic from the rivers of mead that flowed the night before. The night was their time, but the eminent elves were as inevitable as the dawn. A faint tremor broke the trepidatious tranquility, and every mer stood and listened. It was a drum. Ships appeared on the calm sea. Their sails cast great westward shadows in the soft twilight. Trinimac, tallest among the elves, stood like a lighthouse in his shining moonstone plate, guiding the men to the shores. The drumbeat grew in intensity, rolling across the ocean like a tonal tide. Not even Auriel's eagle eyes could spy the drummers upon the approaching longships. Every man stood as still as a statue, swords, shields, and axes held over their chests. In actuality, there was but one drum heralding their advance, and that drum was muffled by the chest it dwelt within. In the vanguard, gripping the prow of his flagship, stood Lorkhan, armoured head to toe in ebony. Even the elves had heard the songs of the northern skalds, that the men could always rally behind their god, for Lorkhan himself was the war drum. And the more he exerted himself on the field of battle, the more intensely the drum would boom. The more elves he slew, the quicker the pace of the conflict. It was their greatest advantage. But Trinimac was the most prolific warrior among the gods, and soon the rhythm would stop. The longships formed a line and slid onto the stony shores of Tamriel. The battle was brutal and bloody. Axes smashed against shields. Swords sang as the steel and silver blades clashed. It seemed to last an eternity, yet the entire battle began and ended before the sun fully emerged. It was as if Mundus itself watched with bated breath, and the realm was trapped in a sempiternal state of twilight, until the fate of the dawn was decided. Perhaps the Elnathay War would have been waged in perpetuity. Could you even call it never-ending if the laws of time were yet to be solidified? Trying to answer such riddles is like trying to recall a dream after waking. It fell upon the lofty shoulders of Trinimac to bring the war to a sudden end. He swung penitent, the blade of courage, in a great sideways arc, sundering 100 men in a single motion. A path opened before him like a fissure across the battlefield, and directly before the Golden Champion stood the Doom Drum. They charged at one another, and the collision was titanic. Lorkhan's axe struck Trinimac's blade, and the force of it disarmed both gods. With gauntleted hands, Trinimac beat the Doom Drum. With ferocity unseen in all the Orbis, Auriel's champion tore the plates of ebony from Lorkhan's chest. The god of men fell to his knees before the tangled armies. Every man and mer fell still and silent. Only the drumbeat made a sound now. Trinimac removed his gauntlets, and with more than hands he penetrated Lorkhan's chest and ripped his heart free. A torrent of crimson spattered his golden plate, and with a great roar, Auriel's champion held the doom drum aloft. The trickster was undone. The war was over. The men dragged Lorkhan's body away and swore blood vengeance on the heirs of Auriel for all time. But their curses could not be heard over the elated cries of the elves. Trinimac once more gazed toward the distant horizon and saw that the sun was finally rising. Trinimac was possibly the greatest god in the Elder Days, even more popular in some places than Auriel. Yet Trinimac would suffer the most severe and humiliating of downfalls, for the curses of men are not to be taken lightly, and Lorkhan's divine will would not tolerate such disrespect, not within his own domain. This is the tale of Trinimac's ruin and the rise of Malacath, the god of curses. The monomyth gives us the final piece of the Elnathay War. It states, "But when Trinimac and Auriel tried to destroy the heart of Lorkhan, it laughed at them. It said, 'This heart is the heart of the world, for one was made to satisfy the other.' So Auriel fastened the thing to an arrow and let it fly long into the sea, where no aspect of the new world may ever find it." For a time, Auriel and Trinimac did not think any more of Lorkhan. The trickster god was sundered, and they had more pressing problems to deal with. Despite the victory, the mortal trap remained, and the gods tried desperately to find a way back to Aetherius. Trinimac had no more battles to fight, so instead he used his influence to persuade the rapidly degenerating Elnathay that the only way to return to heaven relied on unification. Trinimac preached the sacred ideals of strength, honor and unity. Strength in numbers, honor in adhering to ancient traditions, and unity among all elf kind. Without these ideals, the mortal races would divide and unwittingly lend to the legitimacy of Lorkhan's trap. But in putting down the sword, Trinimac had become less vigilant. Some say he became soft. Trinimac claimed that tears were the best response to the sundering, and disparaged the missing god Lorkhan's name at every opportunity. It was only a matter of time before people began to take offense at these inflammatory words. Once the dawn had turned to day, the risen sun had dispelled any uncertainty about the fate of the mortal realm. The trickster's heart continued to beat, and the earth bones were set in their places. Auriel and Trinimac tried desperately to deny this reality, to shelter the weakening spirits from the evils that lurked within the corners of Sithis' shadow house. But the elves were curious. Many wished to explore this new world, to come to grips with their mortality, and to forge legacies of their own. Prophet Veloth was one such Aldmer. He grew tired of Trinimac's rhetoric, but didn't quite have the courage to openly refute the paragon of strength and honor. It would take a being of transcendent power to defy the Golden Champion. It would take another god. Even the gods, though, would have been cautious about crossing Trinimac, for he had torn out Lorkhan's heart with more than hands. Perhaps it would take a god who had not devoted any of their power to the creation of the mortal realm, and it would take a helping of deception too. Well, there just so happened to be one potent spirit inhabiting the waters of oblivion, who had taken quite an interest in the goings-on of this mortal realm. This spirit is known as the Deceiver, the Prince of Plots, and she just so happens to possess a deep adoration for the trickster god Lorkhan. Therefore, she had good reason to despise Trinimac and to empower Prophet Veloth. This Daedric prince is named Boethiah, the Dark Warrior. Just as Trinimac is Auriel's champion, Boethiah is Lorkhan's. What came next was the greatest humiliation in the history of Tamriel, one that would shape the political landscape of the realm ever after, creating two new races of Mer in the process. There are various accounts of Trinimac's transformation. Some say the Dark Warrior acted alone. Others say that she caught him in a web spun by an ally. Some say the Prince of Plots tricked the Paragon. Others say Trinimac challenged the daedra to a duel. Some say the entire tale is an exaggerated metaphor. According to the Lord of Souls novel by Greg Keyes, there is a children's tale that depicts the deception. In it, Boethiah took on the form of a beautiful girl and asked Trinimac for a kiss. But as he leaned forward to kiss her, her mouth opened wide, so wide that his whole head went in, and Boethiah swallowed him in a single gulp. Then Boethiah took on Trinimac's form and made him burp and fart and say foolish things. The text titled The Changed Ones elaborates on this version of events. One day, Boethiah, Prince of Plots, precocious youth, tricked Trinimac to go into his mouth. Boethiah talked like Trinimac for a while then, and gathered enough people to listen to him. Boethiah showed them the lies of the Atada, the daedra, and told them Trinimac was the biggest liar of all, saying all this with Trinimac's voice. Boethiah told the masses before him the triangled truth. He showed them, with Mephala, the rules of Psijic endeavour, He taught them how to build houses and what items they needed to bury in the corners. He demonstrated the right way to wear their skin. He performed the way to walk to achieve an exodus. Then Boethiah relieved himself of Trinimac right there on the ground before them to prove all the things he said were the truth. The Orcish version of events, as written in the text Morlock Orcfather, is understandably more charitable to their patron deity. An age ago, a cult of elves left the Somerset Isles, abandoning their kin to follow Veloth, a pathetic tool of Boethiah. Trinimac confronted Boethiah for this trespass and was challenged to battle. Trinimac was about to strike a mighty blow when Mephala appeared and stabbed him in the back. As Trinimac knelt, wounded by Mephala's treachery, Boethiah gloated and cast a terrible ritual to scar and twist his appearance, then cast him to a place of choking air and ash. Unfortunately, the former version of events is the one that stuck. Mephala was almost certainly involved in some capacity, for she is the plot weaver, the Whispering Lady, and she knew that defeating Trinimac would not suffice. Only humiliation would ensure that the Golden Champion could never reclaim his immaculate reputation. This is why it is essential that all Tamriel hear the tale of Trinimac passing through Boethiah's bowels, and why he needed to be excreted in a heap of dung. Some elves continue to worship Trinimac despite his terrible transmogrification, and they became the Orsimer. To complete the betrayal, Trinimac, who was now Malacath, the cursed god, had to be banished to a realm that was the opposite of Dawn's beauty, a place where nothing green could survive. In the text titled The Doors of Oblivion, Malacath's ash pit is described as a place where anguish, betrayal and broken promises filled the bitter air like ash. Few mortals have seen the ash pit, for Malacath must protect it from deceivers, but those who have know that it is impossible to breathe without magical aid. There is no colour but for a million shades of grey, and the only respite is the ashen forge at the realm's heart, reserved for those who followed him after the transformation. Perhaps the saddest aspect of Trinimac's exile is that he still remembers Dawn's beauty. He still yearns for Tamriel. He had spent his weakened days preaching unity so that the Elnathay could return to Aetherius. Yet once he had lost his place in Lorkhan's realm, he recognised the wondrous collaboration that is the mortal realm. Auriel had created time so that the sun would rise and set every day. Ifri had created the green and all the pretty things that live and die within it. And even Magnus, despite his abandonment, had given the gifts of light and magic in his departure. In the Lord of Souls novel, two mortals are shown a glimpse of the Ash Pit, a part that Malacath keeps in memory of Trinimac and Tamriel. It reads, "Around them rose a garden of slender trees, and wound about the trunks were vines festooned with lily-like flowers. A multitude of spheres moved, deep in the colourless sky, as distant and pale as moons. He heard birds chirping, but it was a doleful sound, as if something with a vague memory of having been a bird was trying to reproduce sounds it no longer felt. This place, this shadow of a garden, this echo of something that once was. Trinimac had been the champion of Auriel, of Anu's ineffable light. He had fought against Lorkhan, who brought the limiting darkness of Sithis into the world. He tried to recreate a slice of Dawn's beauty in his realm, but it would always be a shadow of the real thing, an echo of past glory. Just like Lorkhan in the Elnathay War, Trinimac was now undone. Just as he had ripped the heart from the trickster's ribcage, Trinimac had sliced open his own chest, tearing the shame from his spirit. The reality is, though, all of the virtues Trinimac espoused exist within Malacath as well, but appearances are everything in the fickle minds of mortals. Malacath isn't even truly a Daedric prince, nor do most of the other princes recognise him as such. He is something in between, an outcast in every sense of the word. Before his transformation, Trinimac was a leader, a father figure, and the paragon of strength, honour and unity. Now let's look at Malacath. Malacath is embittered. He was cursed by the good daedra, but he is also afflicted by self-pity. Because of this, some call him weak and vengeful. But that is only one side of the prince. When Trinimac's purity was besmirched, so too were all those Aldmer who chose to remain by his side. They too became green and pig-faced. They were corrupted in the eyes of the pristine, bright-skinned elves. But the cause of their corruption was noble and pure. It was their loyalty that turned them into pariahs, and for that reason, Malacath will never abandon them, no matter the hardships they as a people endure. Boethiah had been victorious in further sundering the uniformity of the elves, so now Malacath made it his mission to maintain the virtues of strength, honour and unity, not among all elf kind, but among those who stood by him. Malacath is a paternal figure to the Orcimer, which means pariah folk. Malacath spoke his code to the Orcs. Do not steal, do not kill your kin, do not attack without cause. Those who break these rules must pay the blood price. Since it's not explicitly written down, there are additional tenets. According to varieties of faith, the Orcs, these tenets include respect for forging and blacksmithing, the traditional roles of a clan's chief and his wives, the tradition of selection of a new chief through challenge and combat, the custom that one who commits a crime must pay blood price to the victim or victim's relatives, the requirement that insults to honour must be avenged, recognition that to die in combat pleases Morlock. The blood price is a form of punitive justice unique to the Orcimer. If an orc commits a crime against another, they must pay the victim or the victim's family. This can involve the exchange of possessions, but in the event that the victim refuses, or the culprit has nothing to offer, then they can offer their lifeblood. The offender spills their blood before the victim until the victim is satisfied with the amount. The blood price, among other aspects of stronghold orc culture, leads many of Tamriel's races to consider the orcs savages, but these rules are clear and they are just. It prevents crime and infighting among a race that has plenty of enemies beyond their borders. And speaking of borders, the pariah folk have never truly been able to settle anywhere in Tamriel. Various iterations of an orcish citadel named Orsinium have been erected, only for neighbouring societies to tear them down. So it's hard to blame the orcs for their insularity. Despite being constantly downtrodden throughout history, Malacath stands by the Orcimer, and he considers himself responsible for their continued existence. He protects them and guides them, but it is also a part of his fatherly nature to be responsible for reprimanding them when necessary. Malacath's dealings with the Mad God perfectly encapsulate his paternal instincts. In the 16 Accords of Madness, Volume 12, we can learn the story of Emeg Grokeira. Emeg's mother died in childbirth. His father was never known to him, and so he was raised by shamans in the frigid peaks of northern High Rock. After forging an ornate suit of scaled armour, Emeg set out across Tamriel as a wandering vagabond. He made a name for himself defending merchant caravans from brigands and liberating enslaved beast folk. One night, when making camp, Emeg heard the frail voice of a cloaked figure, inexplicably speaking Orcish. The stranger presented Emeg with a gift, Neb Crescent, an intricately carved arc of honed steel. Little did the warrior know this was a cursed gift, an artifact of Sheogorath that causes the wielder to kill with reckless abandon. A week after receiving the gift, while wandering the forests, Emeg caught the scent of a quarry. He drew the seductive blade. The first moment of conscious memory in Emeg Grokeira's mind after drawing Neb Crescent was the image of the curved blade sweeping through the air in front of him, spattering blood over the virginal powder coating the forest floor. The second memory was a feeling of frenzied bloodlust creeping over him, but it was then that he saw for the first time his victim, an orc woman perhaps a few years younger than himself. Her body a canvas of grisly wounds, enough to kill a strong man 10 times over. Emeg's disgust overwhelmed the madness that had overtaken him, and with all his will enlisted, he released Neb Crescent from his grip and let the blade sail. With a discordant ringing, it spun through the air and was buried in a snowdrift. Emeg fled the scene in shame and horror, drawing the hood of his cloak up to hide himself from the judging eyes of the rising sun. The scene where Emeg Grokeira had murdered one of his own kind was a macabre one. Below the neck, the body was flayed and mutilated almost beyond recognition, but the untouched face was frozen in a permanent expression of abject terror. It was here that Sheogorath performed certain rites that summoned Malacath, and the two Daedric lords held court in the presence of the disfigured corpse. Malacath was grief-stricken by the sight, yet he took full responsibility in reaping vengeance on the victim's behalf. But Sheogorath implored Malacath to use a weapon of the Mad God's choosing, so that the soul of the perpetrator would be banished to the Shivering Isles, and he chose Neb Crescent. Malacath acquiesced, unaware of the blade's sinister nature. Malacath materialized in the path of the murderer, the cloaked figure obscured through a blizzard haze. Bellowing a curse so foul as to wilt the surrounding trees, the blade was drawn, and Malacath crossed the distance more quickly than a wild fox. Frothing with rage, he swung the blade in a smooth arc, which lopped the head of his foe cleanly off, then plunged the blade up to its hilt in his chest, choking off the spurts of blood into a steady, growing stain of red, bubbling from beneath the scaled armor and heavy cloak. Panting from the unexpected immediacy and fury of his own kill, Malacath rested on a knee as the body before him collapsed heavily backwards, and the head landed roughly upon a broad, flat stone. The next sound broke the silence like a bolt. I'm sorry, sputtered the voice of Emeg Grokera. Malacath's eyes went wide as he looked upon the severed head, seeping blood from its wound, but somehow kept alive. Its eyes wavered wildly, trying to focus on the aspect of Malacath before it. The once proud eyes of the champion were choked with tears of grief, pain and confused recognition. To his horror, Malacath recognized only now that the man he had killed was not only one of his awesomer children, but very literally a son he had blessed an Orc maiden with years hence. For achingly long moments the two looked upon each other, despondent and shocked. Malacath had been fooled by Sheogorath into believing that he too sought justice for the victim. In truth, the Mad God had orchestrated the entire sequence of events. He corrupted and tormented this honourable Orc, and tricked Malacath into butchering his own offspring. Despite being a Daedric prince, Malacath despises trickery and deception. Whenever the Lords of Oblivion rear their demonic heads on Tamriel, there is always some wily scheme. He has preached as much since the dawn, when Lorcan and the men brought Sithis into every quarter. He loathes these traits, and despite being banished to Oblivion, will not allow them to corrupt him. Ironically, despite his hideous transformation, Malacath is the least corruptible of the Daedric princes. In truth, as we can gather from the descriptions of the Ash Pit and his interactions with mortals, Malacath laments his place in the Orbis. He is an daedra in every sense of the word. He played a major role in the creation of the Mundus, and he remained within the trap long after many others had fled. Yet now he is cursed to be the antithesis of everything he once stood for. He actively hates the daedra. This much is clear from the creation of his artifact Scourge, a legendary axe forged from sacred ebony in the fires of Fickledire. It is often called the Bane of Daedra, as the spawn of Oblivion cannot wield it, and it can banish Daedra to the void with a single blow. But there is no daedra Malacath abhors more than Boethiah. As such, I believe he also wished to see the Chimera suffer. They were the ones who followed Boethiah after all, and defied Trinimac's teachings to become the Changed Ones. This is a major topic for a future video, but there is good reason to believe that Malacath opted to make an alliance with the Dwemer in order to undermine Boethiah and the Chimera. Malacath's best known artifact, the Warhammer Volendrung, was in fact forged by the dwarves, and was wielded by the chieftain of the Rorcan clan. And King Jumac of Vardenfell is often referred to as Jumac Dwarf Orc, even Ju-Malacath in some sources. Malacath's greatest enemies are all Padamaic in nature. Lorcan, Boethiah, Mephala, they all carry out the will of Sithis. Malacath is an anti-daedra. Boethiah succeeded in changing public opinion of Trinimac and sullying his reputation, but she failed in killing the Golden Champion, because Malacath, despite appearances, is still Trinimac. Even in Khajiit spirituality, in the text titled The Adversarial Spirits, Amon-Dro writes, Lorcage and Boethra battled the demon in the ancient songs, but Orca could only be banished and would not die. Aside from his appearance and his exile, the only major difference between Malacath and Trinimac is the addition of vengeance and bloody oaths to his sphere of influence. But I believe that vengeance and oaths are a part of his honour. Yes, honour is about respect and virtue, but it is also about fulfilling obligations and keeping to your word. In the Dawn, Trinimac encompassed the ideals of strength, honour and unity. Nothing has changed. But I also believe that Trinimac's humiliation came with an epiphany, one that might give him something in common with his ancient enemy Lorcan. Typically, Daedric princes seem to be envious of the daedra. Yes, they avoided committing their power to the creation of the mortal realm, but they also see the veneration mortals have for the daedra and covet it for themselves. I'm speaking in generalizations here, but it is certainly true that the daedra lords want to be relevant. They want to be recognized and revered by mortals. Trinimac was the most beloved of the gods on Tamriel, yet he was more interested in escaping Lorkhan's trap. But now that he finally has escaped, in the form of a Daedric prince, he realizes that it was the same trap that gave him his true purpose. He loved being the savior of the weaker spirits. He was their idol, their paternal figure, their golden champion. The ash pit is far from hospitable, but Malacath is the lord of this plane, and he can shape it. Given the opportunity, he did not shape it into a duplicate of Aetherius. No, he shaped it into Dawn's beauty. He pictured a viridescent garden of slender trees and vibrant flowers, with a brilliant blue sky overhead and birds warbling amid the verdure. He tried to mimic it, but he could not change the colourless sky, and he could not make the birds sing merry songs, as if something with a vague memory of having been a bird was trying to reproduce sounds it no longer felt. It was a shadow of Dawn's beauty, an echo of something that once was. Malacath misses Tamriel dearly. He misses Lorkhan's creation. He misses being Trinimac, and he will hold an eternal grudge against those who tore him away from the beauty of the Dawn. And that is the tale of Trinimac's downfall and Malacath's rise from the ashes. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. Links to my Twitter and Discord can be found in the description below, along with my Patreon, but please only pledge if you can afford it. My name is Drew the Daedrologist. You've been watching Drewmora, and I'll see you in the next one.